I am Vicky Jeter. I am the contract practitioner, spiritual director for Louisville Center for Spiritual Living Teaching Chapter, who's hosting this event. And our presenters today with me are Suzanne Harrill, who is an intuitive counselor, a family therapy counselor, incredibly wise woman who actually supported my process for a good 20 years. That is a part of how I got to where I am today in my life. And Dr. William Emerson, who is a pioneer in the field of pre and perinatal psychology. Pre and perinatal psychology addresses the journey coming into being human. And so the concept is that life is a continuum, and whatever you might believe about that in your own journey is just fine. There's all kinds of room for that. It's not about trying to change your belief about how you got here or where you're going, but it is about making room to honor the whole story of who you are, how you got here, and then thusly, as we integrate more fully the awarenesses that come as we come into being human, it opens up the full range of potential of who we can be. And the value of this today in our world is not only for those of us here individually on our own journeys, but as most of us are aware, so many challenging things can be benefited by some resolve. And that is our intention today, the three of us together, and for all of you collectively. I want to officially say welcome to this presentation on how to address the awareness of trauma and its influences that cause dis-ease. And that could be dis-ease at any level of life. And as is our way through the Louisville Center for Spiritual Living Teaching Chapter that is hosting this event, we want to begin by doing just a centering to allow ourselves to consciously shift from where each of us has been in our own worlds into coming together. So start by taking a nice deep breath, breathing in gently and expanding, and then releasing slowly and completely in kindness to your nervous system. And as we continue to breathe and come into harmony together in breathing, it signifies coming into this room in common. In spirit, we are in the same room. And in that recognition is the presence of the divine creator by any name for each and every one of us. All paths are welcome here. All questions are welcome here. All histories, individually and generationally, are welcome here. And we invite the presence of that which is greater than we are to support and guide and guard this journey to the level of its highest and best outcome for each person here present and each person who might be listening to this in the future. And so, taking your own time in your own way, with a moment to set your own intention. When you're ready, come on back. So to begin, I'm going to share just a little bit of my story, and then introducing William and Suzanne. They will be sharing a bit of their story. And then we're going to be able to present you some material that goes into more depth. We'll be looking at the spiritual aspect of the effects of trauma and how to resolve it, the mental and emotional aspects of trauma and some ways to resolve it, and then also somatically how trauma correlates in the body and how to do some resolve for it. And you might imagine all of these areas in lots of ways are like a kaleidoscope. They come together. And by the time we get through those three segments and we open it up to questions, you'll be able to kind of see within your own stories, probably, that it all mixes together quite a bit. And we're certainly open to questions. It will be more effective. I want to ask everybody to write down your questions, if you would please, and save them for the question and answer period, because we're each going to take just 15 minutes. And if we try to answer questions in the middle of those segments, it will detract from the questions and answers, time to share more deeply at the end. So to begin, the piece of my story that I believe is probably the most valuable today is how I became aware that for all of the potentials that I have had in my adult life, this was in my early 20s, no matter what I did, it always felt like I was being held down by what I call free-floating anxiety. And I was aware that there was an underlying feeling of anxiety most of the time, but I had no idea that there was a way that what I had been through added up to this idea that I was like marinating in this underlying pool of anxiety that almost anything could trigger, and I could be starting out with the happiest, freest day in the world, and then something would come along almost every day and cause me to feel anxious. And I wanted to share that piece especially today because getting an understanding of how powerful the traumas that we've experienced in life are in impacting what we go through in our daily lives, I think is a huge necessary awakening. Because I know for me, I had no idea that the things I had lived through from the time I was born till the time I was in my early 20s and just began to start figuring all this out, I had no idea that the unresolved traumas that I had been through were still impacting. It's like a pool of water, like the residual energies from all the things I had been through that had not been yet resolved. Every time something that reminded me of those things would drop in like a pebble, my whole system would go off. See, now this is a thing. All I have to do is talk about it and it comes up. That right there is a perfect example of how the story translates through the body. And what I want to offer just a little bit of, first of all, I know I didn't name any of the traumas I'm referring to, so I do want to just kind of give you an idea for context. I was born 7 months to term, 2 months early, and I was born with spastic cerebral palsy. So for a premature baby, you know, the first 2 months of our lives, we're actually still really embryonic. We're still really supposed to be in the womb. So everything that happens within that first 2 months is potentially traumatic. And a baby in that stage can't consciously process that. We don't have the circuitry online to be able to do that. But what's true, this is part of how the body becomes that receptacle, because the energies moving through still impact the whole system, and what isn't processed gets held somewhere. And so in addition to being born early, both of my parents were alcoholic and both challenged. They loved me very much, but they were both challenged. I had 5 orthopedic surgeries between the time I was 2 and 10. There were exacerbating challenges all along the way. And then as I moved into my adult life, all of the challenges my parents had in their alcoholism that were unresolved, even though I was not an alcoholic, those patterns, like that pool of energy, their trauma actually came through and expressed in my life. And this is one way that we talk about how the sins of the father shall be passed down to the son. Well, when you think about that, that saying isn't saying that, you know, we're just born sinful and this is the way it's going to be. It's because if things are unresolved at the point where they happen, they're going to carry over. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn this over to Suzanne to share her introductory piece.
Thank you, Vicky. I can really relate to being in my 20s and not knowing why I was anxious. I'm going to give a concrete example of something that's affected me my whole life. Can you hear me? Okay. And originally was going to talk about a cancer experience, but I have written about that in my new book. And so I don't feel like I need to talk about that example. When I was 5 years of age, I talked my dad into letting me get a boy's haircut. And he took me to his barber. I mean, I asked him many times. And, you know, back in 1950, there wasn't, girls were not wearing boy haircuts. And he took me to his barber, and I even remember him saying, "Are you sure you want me to do this?" And so he cut my hair like a boy, and I was so happy because it was summertime and I wasn't hot with all this hair. And we went home, and my mom saw my hair, and she went berserk. She had a big comb in her hand, and she went up to my dad and she started hitting him and hitting him. "Why did you do, how could you do this?" And she was throwing an anger tantrum, temper tantrum. And as a 5-year-old, I thought, and I couldn't put it into words until I was older, I got my dad in trouble. I'm the one she should be beating. I'm the one that she's angry at. And I made a decision, which we can talk about how thoughts interact with our emotional. I made a decision that anger was bad and I would never be angry. Well, guess what happens when you do that? You attract people with those patterns, because what you disown shows up outside yourself. And I have worked on that pattern for many years, and I would say I do really well now. But I wanted to use that as my illustration today for when it's my piece to talk about thoughts and feelings, and we can use that example to where I can reveal more.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I am one of our speakers, but I'm also our moderator. And so we're just doing a little shift. We're going to officially pass the talking stick to Dr. William. And so it is your turn, William.
Yeah, thank you. Up until this minute, I really haven't had an idea which trauma of mine to speak about. And even in this moment, I haven't made up my mind, but I will. Huh. People often ask me, how in the world did you ever get interested in a field like pre and perinatal psychology? And what is that anyway? And then what? And my answer was usually because I had so many traumas in my prenatal life before I was born. And I had so many birth traumas, and I had traumas in the first year of my life, tremendously difficult traumas. So I think it's possible under hypnosis, which is not a difficult state of consciousness for anybody to access. It's called hypnotherapy. And under hypnotherapy, one time I went all the way back to birth, and then I was in the prenatal world. And suddenly I was looking at the planet from a distance. And I was really shocked. I mean, I thought, am I psychotic here? I mean, is this a memory? Am I making this up? I mean, I had all kinds of doubts. But consistently, about a dozen times, I ended up regressing back to this place and time. It had more and more meaning. And the more I spent time there, the more what I discovered explained certain patterns in my life that were destructive to my faith, to my Christian faith. I thought to tell you that story because, oh, somebody's got a cat. Kristen. Good, we have a dog and a cat. So, and what I discovered was a syndrome because at that time I'd had a few clients I worked with. I'm a psychologist, so I did hypnotherapy with them. And they also went back to before conception. And I might just add that there's a book, and I'll give this to you, Vicky, to share with them later. So, I have it written down. It's called Windows on the Womb. And Dr. David Chamberlain was a memory expert his whole life and verified that, yes, people do have birth memories. People do have prenatal memories. And yes, there is absolutely clear evidence that there are memories that occur before conception when there is no physical body to hold memory. And there are ways to explain how that's possible. There's not time to get into it. And the interesting thing is I had a syndrome that I came to call divine homesickness. And I actually experienced myself getting further and further away from the divine as I came towards the planet. And the closer I came to the planet, the sadder and sadder I got. And I spent some sessions just sobbing and crying and really not wanting to leave the divine. When I looked ahead, I had some prescience, I had some telepathy. I could see some things that were going to happen to me, or I thought they were. And they actually did happen, actually in life. And I decided, I don't know if I want to go to this planet. And so for the first 20 years of my life, assuming that I did have those preconception experiences, I forgot all about them. I was born, my first 20 years of my life, I had something like a clinical depression, except I was studying psychology from the time I was 10 years old, way advanced in my knowledge of psychology, and I knew I wasn't clinically depressed. It was something deeper. And it conflicted with my faith because every time I got close to, I had some visions of Mother Mary, and I got very confused, and I got angry, and I got sad, and it didn't make any sense. She should have been an enlightening experience for me. Anyway, to make a long story short, I had a twin sister. We were together in the womb. We were both born together, not at the same time, but I came first, she came second. And my whole life, up until I was 20, 30, even 40, I had visions of a woman that actually grew up with me and got older with me. She was my age, and I never knew who she was. So when in my 20s, I did some hypnotherapy regressions with the hypnotherapist and discovered that I had a twin sister. I went to my parents. They said, yes, you did have a twin sister. But my memory was in hypnosis that she died 12 hours after birth. In fact, medical records said she died 12 hours after birth. There was all kinds of corroborations of the memories I had in regression. They were corroborated by my parents in the medical records. Gave me great confidence that memories are possible. So I share that because it was both an affirmation that we can remember, and also that memories can be obstructive of faith. And since I resolved my twin loss around the age of 30 by grieving her loss. And it was the deepest grief I've ever imagined possible. I don't want to go through that again, but it was entirely relieving, changed my whole life, my whole body, feelings changed, my anxiety disorder went away. I've been absolutely fine since. So, and I've had some wonderful, endearing, rejuvenating experiences of Mother Mary and meditations in different places and in temples and churches and whatever. So to return to the natural faith, to an unobliterated faith, one needs to get rid of the memories that happened back in those places and times. Thanks for listening.
Wow. Thank you, William. I'm sure people are starting to write down questions. I see people taking notes. So now I'm going to share for 15 minutes on particularly the spiritual aspect of trauma and its effects on disease, and how not only the spiritual aspects, of some of which Wayne was just touching into, but also how that empowered me moving out of some of the examples I was giving. But before I do that, I do have some information to share, and I want to start by doing a little guided meditation. So I know many of you are like sitting up in your chairs, but see if you can sit back, get a little comfortable. This isn't going to be a long meditation. I don't even know how many minutes, but it's for a very specific purpose that has to do with getting a stronger felt sense orientation to trauma without having to touch into any of your own traumas that are personal. So just see if you can get comfortable for a minute. Take a pausing breath. Create some space from what you have heard. And sometimes in guided meditations, people will say, find your comfortable place. And I'm going to invite you not to do that. This is going to be an opportunity to dance with a little discomfort for a minute, but not personal. So it's okay. And you can even watch it on a movie screen if you don't know me well enough and it's hard to kind of trust what I'm going to say next. Because I want to invite you to think of a time when you have been somewhere, and possibly if it's happened at home, it would even be better because it's more personal. See if you can think of a time when you experienced a toilet that got stopped up. And clearly, none of us really knows necessarily in advance when the toilet's going to stop up because we're moving through our day or whatever. And if we knew the toilet was stopped up, we would never do what? We would never go and push that lever down. So you're going through this experience and you are just naturally through with what you're doing, and you go and you push that lever down and it doesn't flow through. And you're watching that water rise, and you have around you your tile and your bathroom towels and your rug that's on the floor, and here comes that water. And just stop and think, how does that feel when you suddenly realize that the toilet is gonna overflow? Now, when the toilet actually overflows, how much control do we have over that? And what kinds of resulting mess and unknowns and, the rhythm of your day is certainly interrupted because you can't walk away from the water on the floor. Something's got to be done. You may or may not have access to a plumber to get help. That is an example of an extreme in energy. And for any of you who have found yourself, who knows how often, saying, I was in this experience and I just felt overwhelmed. And as I started to feel overwhelmed, I couldn't think, or I couldn't do what I knew I wanted to do. Somehow I couldn't function. Somehow everything got interrupted and sort of stopped. And so now, with that idea in mind, take another breath and clear the space. Like if you had an eraser, you could clear that whole story and walk through it again. So you're going through your day, you're in the bathroom, you go to flush it, and you suddenly realize that water is rising and you have the plunger. You have that nice little plunger just for this kind of situation. And you know, all I have to do, man, I reach down, I grab that plunger, and I go after it. And suddenly, just about the time the water's just getting ready to go over the edge, you plunge that sucker down and the flow goes through. No problem. All is well. Disaster averted. And how does that feel? And after you've had a moment to imagine that, my guess is probably everybody here has had exactly those two experiences. And when you're ready, come on back. And now, Vernon, as we can kind of see, people have had a second to come back. Give me the first slide. Okay, so with that felt sense example in mind, that is a representation of what trauma energy does. And so now I'm going to give you an actual definition of trauma. In physical terms, trauma refers to bodily harm or injury. In psychological terms, trauma refers to the negative and distressing life experiences which are emotionally painful, but which can be coped with. Trauma is characterized by painful circumstances in which the victim has some power to alter the course or intensity of the events. So in the two scenarios that I just painted, which one is the more empowered? And go ahead and switch the slide. And Doug is saying in the chat, absolutely, the flow. Oh, okay, so thank you. So in moving this, there is the clarity between what is actual physical trauma, what is psychological trauma, and then the most severe levels of trauma go into what can be termed as shock. You guys have probably all heard, like, you keep a blanket in the back of your car should you ever come upon a car accident and someone is physically damaged and hurt to the point where they might go into physical shock. What's true is psychologically the same kind of thing can happen. And what defines that level of severity is whether or not the system literally finds it necessary to go offline. So when you're going through something and you suddenly have that feeling like, wow, I don't know what happened. I just couldn't think. It just, everything stopped. And that can happen when we're in the middle of an experience, and that can happen later. Because, and this is one of the most important points I wanted to make about how much I appreciate everyone being here, because our society doesn't get about trauma, you know, we're so geared to the email pace and what's next, and let's just get through it. Let's get through it and move on. But trauma doesn't move on. Trauma sits as an unrequited energy that is being held somewhere. And so to realize that when we don't address that energy, then it's there to come back again. Somebody mentioned, I think William said, you know, why do I keep doing this when he was just beginning to learn about this himself? Well, actually, that's nature's intention, to touch back into this energy that's being held in the system, to say, we got to get this cleared out. It would be like, can you imagine if somebody's toilet overflowed and they didn't have the knowledge or the resourcing or the whatever that it needed to be cleaned up? That's kind of like what we do when something traumatic has happened and we say, oh, I don't have time to deal with this now. I'm going to deal with that later. And I don't mean to be laughing, because this is, in all sincerity, this is the kind of thing that happens. And so the other thing that I wanted to share with you about that touches back into my own story is the spiritual part of this. You know, in all of the things that I went through, and I began to become aware in my 20s, it kind of happened all at the same time. I became aware on a human level some of what was going on with me. And then I also became a practitioner of this teaching. And the spiritual significance of all of this, or one of them, there are many, but I'm going to use this one. In one of my first Science of Mind classes, I was sitting with Reverend Dr. Jesse Jennings, and he's talking about how spiritual law doesn't miss. What we put out comes back, etc., etc. That our spiritual life is mirrored in our physical experience. And all of a sudden, I got it. That all that time into my 20s, I had been in a fight with my body. I had been angry with my legs. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that in spirit, there isn't anything wrong. And however it is that my experience added up to my not being able to walk is perfect. It's like 2 + 2 = 4. What I went through in the womb, you know, William was articulating his experience of what went on in the womb. Well, certainly being born early, there was lots of things going on for me in the womb that were extraordinary. And all of that added up perfectly in spiritual law. And thusly, when I was born, the reflection of my body was a perfect match to what was actually going on, and speaking to generational trauma of things that my parents needed to heal. And when I got it, that, oh my goodness, there is perfection here. There is spiritual perfection here. So my job is not to beat up on my body, but my job is to connect with compassion and integrity and move forward, finding out how to realign from that spiritual source to allow my body to be transformed, in my experience of my body and my experience of my life to be transformed. Vernon, can you go to the next slide, please? And so doing that, okay, one of the reasons why all this trauma has happened, and people want to sidestep it. They want to be able to say, can't we just, you know, look at it and nod and say, oh, gee, you know, I'm sorry that happened to you, and move on. We can't do that. And one of the things that's necessary in order to be able to actually deal with what happened and take that mess that ends up on the floor and get it cleaned up is containment and safety. And when you say to yourself, well, what is containment? Well, if you think about traumatic energy overflowing because it hasn't been dealt with, and it's just in this pool that is not well contained, first creating a container that energy is going to be identified in and worked with. And you do that by having a support team. And who knows, containment, it could be different for every story. But if you just think of that idea, like if I spill a gallon of milk and I need to first, get a container, if the milk carton breached, I need to get a container that doesn't have a hole in it. So it's first creating a container that can hold your story, and in a way, and with people that feel safe enough. People tend to sidestep readdressing what has traumatized them or hurt them. But by nature, we don't want to feel unsafe. And if we don't have the container that we need, we're going to feel unsafe. And so then, in addition to containment and safety to deal with it, the watchword for all of this, and this is ongoing, this is like a permanent life change, compassion for everyone that was involved. And that can take a little bit of a reach sometimes, because sometimes what we've been traumatized by, the people that were involved with us were maybe the ones that were doing the traumatizing in our perception, et cetera, et cetera. But in order to really be able to clear it out, it's about finding our way to what would it take for me to come to compassion for myself and or for the other people who were involved. And so if you find yourself asking, well, this thing happened to me, but I don't even really remember it. Well, I just remember the impression it left me. What do I do? Well, this is part of what you do, is begin to reach for compassion. And then when you start that process, the layers, you talk about layers of an onion. Well, this is definitely a layer process. You start where where you can find what to do, and then you trust the process moving on from there. And so then there's one more slide. Go ahead for the next slide, Vernon. Oh, okay. So that's the last of the visuals that I'm offering. But the last thing I want to say about the spiritual component of this is, if I had not gotten clear that there was divinity involved in how I landed here, and I needed to be holding that whole thing in a different way, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, because I never would have evolved to the kind of awareness I have now about my working with spirit rather than fighting against spirit and being angry with God. Because believe me, I went through and I can still get angry with God. It's not about let's don't be angry with God. The difference is being willing to shift my perception and invite spirit into the whole process has brought me from saying this is everything I can't do because of what I've been through, to saying what am I going to be able to do next. It has left me completely empowered, and without that spiritual component that invites in the mystery, where we can have an intimate relationship with God, even in the challenge, and say, hey, this is where we are. So where do we go from here? And having that element of faith that is there along the way, and trusting that God can take our anger, and God can take, our depression, even, whatever it is, just laying it out there, but inviting spirit in, rather than saying, I can't have a spiritual relationship until I don't feel this way anymore. And with that, I will call it complete, and I will turn this over to Suzanne.
Wow. Thank you, Vicky. I want to talk about the relationship between thoughts and emotions. They go together. And if you want to change how you feel, change how you think. The things that are true for you, even if they're false. And we were all taught a lot of things that are not true. But our thoughts become our belief system. And part of what I've done is unravel false beliefs that surrounded the example that I'm using today, that when my mother got angry, I had a belief or a thought that became a belief that anger is bad. Another one being a young child, and for reasons I'm not going to have time to talk about now, I became very codependent with my mother. And I, being a sensitive, empathic person, could feel when she was going to get angry, and it was like my responsibility to make her happy or be good or be what would make her feel safe and calm. And my mom was an only child, and she had me, and then she had my twin brother and sister 2.5 years later. So she was usually on overwhelm. And the beliefs of anger being bad scared me anytime someone got angry. And then I would do it, Vicky was talking about, I would freeze, not know what to do. And in the long run, it has served me because I can do marriage counseling. I can help people uncover anger that they're feeling that they didn't know they were feeling. So it has served me in the long run, but it caused problems when I was first a therapist. I mean, it's very normal for a client to be angry at the therapist, especially if they're working out authority issues. And that really was a freak out for me. And I'm fortunate I had support people to talk to. And I thank those clients because they showed me where I needed to shine the light and grow and heal. And then I married somebody that would behave like my mom. I behaved more like my dad. And in a conflict, I would kind of freeze. Now, it doesn't mean I won't confront. I do have a personality where I want to solve problems and I will confront. But as soon as my husband would get angry, then I would have this feeling as a kid. I was back when I was 5, and I would want to make him happy, over please him, do crazy, nice things when he was being rude. And I'm not saying my husband was abusive, just normal being upset would upset me. So all this was like cooking at the unconscious level. And fortunately, I was always attracted to psychology myself. And so I still can't help reading information that teaches me more about human behavior and myself. And I want to say that there are beliefs that many of us were taught, and the way we go about fixing them or upgrading them is to create affirmations or redo it. And one that I redid, it's like if my husband would get short, or my mother got short, or a client got short, I would say, "You have done nothing wrong. That person is having a tough moment," and they would react that way even if it was somebody else. And those kind of conversations with myself started easing me out of taking responsibility for the other person's piece of an argument. I'm not saying I didn't have my own issues and anger that needed to be addressed, but the more I worked on this, the more conscious I got of my own feelings that I was suppressing, because I taught myself anger is bad. and angry people you stay away from, and you become a people pleaser so that they can be nice. And having nice, and people used to call me nice. And now when people say that I'm nice, I just say, well, I can be, because I can also be not nice if I'm not liking a situation. And I thought I would read some concepts that many of us put into our subconscious mind that you may or may not be aware of. One of my teachers, I taught a class at a university in Thibodaux, Louisiana, many years ago, and L.S. Barksdale's self-esteem curriculum was part of what I taught the students, and I learned so much more about myself. But I take this from L.S. Barksdale: false and destructive concepts of human behavior. If you act bad, you are bad. Winning is the only thing that counts. Losers and low achievers do not count. You should feel guilty for your mistakes, defeats, and failures, for you could have done better if you had tried harder. It is wrong to love yourself. You should be perfect. You should improve yourself. Your worth is determined by how much or how well you do compared with others. You know better, so you should have done better. Now, that one was taught to me in spades. I always was so embarrassed if I made a mistake, even if I didn't know what the correct behavior or actions were, because I was taught, shame on you, you know better. Well, that's quite a negative belief to change so that I can be comfortable with myself and emotionally balanced, even if I make a mistake. Another one is you can validate your worth and justify your existence only through exceptional achievements and the approval and acceptance of others. Outside forces, circumstances, and the actions and attitudes of others are responsible for your unhappiness and hurting. That one was a big one for me. If my mother was unhappy, it was my responsibility. I had to do something about it. And there's more on this, and I have these handouts for you that Vicky will email to you. But what I basically had to learn to do was identify, or with help from another person, identify what the limiting thought was that created my belief system that was not good for me, that made me feel bad when I didn't need to. So that changing the self-talk, changing through affirmations was very important for me. And my main idea I want to get across is when we're emotionally not okay, there's a thought in the background that we may not be aware of. And when we can identify the thought that's going on with that feeling, we can check out whether it's true or false. And if it's false, then you upgrade it. You create affirmations. You create self-talk that's different. And that's one way to work through trauma and then use it to your advantage. Like now, I can get angry. I recognize it in other people, even when they don't know they're angry, like if they're being passive hostile, or I can help people identify what they're feeling when when they also are afraid of their own anger. And so it's kind of my credentials now that I'm not afraid of anger. I'm not afraid to express it, but I can use my awareness to help myself and other people. Okay. I can't hear you.
I know. I had to click the unmute. So taking a breath, if we this is more of an expanded afternoon, we'd be taking maybe a little break. So just take a few breaths, give yourself some room, maybe stretch a little bit, and we are going to turn the word over to William to add in the physical somatic component, the body component.
I want to thank both you, Vicky, and Suzanne. I'm having all kinds of reliving, coming to the similar conclusions both of you have come to. I remember I was extremely extremely bright and intelligent as a child, and so there were really high expectations of me. I even the high school I went to, for example, was they chose about 40 students from around the United States. Every teacher had their PhD, and the average IQ in the school was 155 or something. So there were legitimate expectations of me, and I was completely up to living up to all of those. But I also had extreme performance anxiety. So my therapist said, "Well, you need a new mantra. You need to redo the way you're thinking about yourself." So for 1 year, every day I got up in the morning, I looked at myself in the mirror, I imagined myself, somebody else facing me like a professor or a teacher or a judge or whatever. And I said, "I am not in this world to live up to your expectations." And after about a year of doing that, I was so free. I literally lost 75% of my performance anxiety. And I could decide better what I wanted to specialize in or what I wanted to do. And I could say no to that program. And I mean, I was an overachiever. I was on the basketball team. I was on the baseball team. I was on the tennis team #1. I was this and that. And nobody can keep up with that. So I just started saying, no, I'm not in this world to live up to your expectations. I am not going to play baseball this season. I'm going to go bicycling. La, 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 la. Hello. Thank you, Suzanne. Really refreshing to hear your presentation. Turn the page here, because I have a kind of a little outline. I'm going to be providing you with some information that I don't believe you have, but many of you might have this information. So then it'll just be for you a review. And this presentation is about the somatics of trauma. That obviously, if you have a spiritual crisis, if you have a difficult time in life, in a life transition, if you have really bad thoughts about yourself, if you're codependent, excuse me, I have allergies. There's all kinds of pollens in the air these days. They're all going to show up in your body, and some people call it the trauma body. And in my trainings with people, we all identify places in our body that are part of our quote trauma body. So, where does this come from? Well, there's a vast amount of research from epidemiologists that have found that if there's stress in the prenatal period, so when you were an unborn baby, for whatever reason, if there are war stress or famines or an endemic or a pandemic or your parents were domestically abusive or whatever it would be. If there is significant stress during your gestation, the likelihood of your having diseases in life is very high. Unborn babies who experience prenatal stress as adults are very likely to be obese, be depressed, have cardiac problems, or have cancer, or have anxiety disorders. And the incidence of that is very high. What's the takeaway for this? Well, hey, look at your age. What are your illnesses? What are your symptoms? But even more important, hello, do you have kids? And are they going to have grandkids? The takeaway is if you have a daughter that's pregnant, you and she, you could step in and say, I want to make sure you have no stress or very little stress because I know that this can lead to bad things down the road. So you can actually do something about it. This is very valuable information for you to have. And this data is not unsubstantiated. It's been substantiated by people all over the world. In Scandinavia, they've kept records on exquisite birth records on many, many people and the kinds of traumas they had, not only as unborn babies, but also in the first couple of years of life. And there's no doubt that the more that happens, the more you're predisposed to disease as an adult. Closed case. Research is there. There's a new field of medicine called fetal origins. I can't remember the journalist that wrote the Newsweek magazine about it, but she called it fetal origins. And basically, it's the research about if there's stress in the prenatal period. Okay. Can you do something about it if your grandchild or if you knew one of your own kids is now 40 and you had tons of stress during your pregnancy? Can you do something about it? Oh, yeah. Starts out by naming what the traumas were. That's really important because when you name something, it ceases to have power unless you have a psychological game associated with it. If you become a victim and you complain about how you've been victimized, that's not the doorway you want to go through. If you become a persecutor because of the traumas you've had, that's not a doorway to go through either. If you become a rescuer, that's not a doorway. If you recognize those, if you have those patterns, you have to drop those patterns consciously and just inform your kids what happened. And inform yourselves what happened to you as an unborn baby or as a child. Very helpful just to name what happened to you. Another field of somatics is it's called adverse experiences. Researchers have recently found that if during your childhood you've had 2 or 3 or 4 adverse experiences, you're more likely to have PTSD as an adult and or to get PTSD because of extreme life stress, job stress, difficult pregnancy, death of a father, mother, or loved one, and so forth. So you're predisposed to PTSD. I think we all know what PTSD is. It's the most severe form of trauma. What do I mean by adverse experiences? As a child, it could be accidents, and injuries, and severe losses, and domestic violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, bullying, extreme failure. You can go on and on and on. I think we all can make a good list of traumas we faced when we were kids. Prejudice, well, rejection, being unwanted, having some of your siblings be favored and you're nothing. Another huge um, thing to consider for yourself is to ask yourself, did I have birth trauma? Man, excuse me. Itching in my bronchioles, runny nose, running eyes, sneezing. God, it's been hell. I'm getting through it though. It's starting to go away. Uh, I'll tell you an experiment that was done, no, yeah, by a medical doctor in 1956. And this research study has been reported. I've seen it in 9 or 10 books summarized. I've seen it in 3 or 4 different journals. It's being published a lot. Basically, it was done by Marcel Gébert. She was a French medical doctor hired by the World Health Organization to test underprivileged children throughout the world and try and find ways we can improve their stimulation and diet to help them become better cognitively. Really a noble idea, and she did well at that. She went to Uganda and she was testing babies in Uganda. And much to her surprise, she was startled that they had the highest IQs, not just intelligence, but also emotional IQs of any babies in the world, even higher than Western European babies. I said, what the heck is going on here? So she started looking more closely at what happened to these Ugandan kids. And she found, well, all these kids that tested so well were born at home. They had a birthing system. They had, quote, midwives for centuries, from generation to generation, were comfortable with childbirth. There was no stress around giving birth. They actually gave good nutritional advice. And these birthing elders, they were called, gave continuity of care for women who gave birth. So consequently, she decided, hey, children can be exceptional if they're really cared for during childbirth. Well, what happened was simultaneously the French, they were medicalizing their childbirth system, and they exported their birth technology to Uganda, telling Uganda that they could have safer and more successful births. And the wealthy people really bought into that. And so the mothers in Uganda who lived in the same community, began having hospital births. And she found out that these babies had significantly high cortisol levels after birth. And cortisol is the accepted measure of trauma. So the hospital-born babies in Uganda had high cortisols after birth and for 4 years until the testing stopped because the budget ran out. They knew that was going to happen. So basically, one way you can determine your trauma load, you can't directly assess whether you have birth trauma, but you can actually get a saliva test. There's lots of laboratories around the country, and it's very useful to find out if you have high cortisol levels. You can also do that with your grandkids and your kids. You can drive people crazy. Not only that, but there are books that are written. There are diets you can follow that actually help you to manage your cortisol levels, so you can actually lose a lot of weight by controlling and moderating your cortisol levels. You can also, by just simply naming your traumas and talking them over with friends, you can lose weight, become less depressed. The serotonin levels will increase, oxytocin levels will increase, and so forth. The thing about cortisol is it's been established recently that cortisol destroys oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, and it also destroys serotonin and dopamine, so that you don't have much of a chance of have a satisfying life unless if your chemical levels, if your hormone levels, especially cortisol, are high. I could even explain to you why it's so high. But it's all been described by neurobiologists. Just for fun, I can give you a couple symptoms of birth trauma. Uh, one is, yeah, one is for prenatal trauma. So this is a simple test. You go into your bathroom or somewhere where you have a mirror that you can see your torso, and you take off your top and make sure nobody's there around, you have privacy. And if you stand up and you look at your torso, and if you have a C curve that goes from one shoulder to your hip, by C curve I mean one side of your, either the left side of your body will be curved, do it this way, curved in like this. So one side of your body on one side or the other will be curved in. And if you have that posture, really, you probably have some kind of significant prenatal trauma, because that's the posture you're most in when you're lying on your mother's spine in the last trimester before birth. So it signifies what happens is any trauma, any posture that becomes stylized in your body, it reflects unresolved trauma. So anyway, just for fun, you can see if you have what's called a C curve. And 98% of people have a birth lie. In other words, during their birth, they lie on the right side or left side. And that's also where you can get a C curve, because your mother's spine is curved. So you're lying on a curved space. The other thing you can do is light side and a cortisol test, C curve.
So, William,
Yeah.
we actually have the first question that comes right off of what you just said.
Okay.
Katrina is asking, is the C curve, is that from front to back or side to side for the C curve?
It goes from in like this. It goes in like this. So your right or left side will have the hip will be higher, the shoulder will be a little lower. Usually, all this shoulder can be really high, but you basically it's a C curve in your torso, either on this side or this side.
So it's side to side and not front to back. Yeah, side to side.
Yeah.
And so, do you have like a closing statement or something that you wanted to give?
Yeah, I think there's just name it. There's a book by Talbot called Cortisol Connection. You can buy it on Amazon, and it gives you diets and exercises to reduce and stabilize your cortisol levels. There's also a woman called Dr. Schwarzbein, and actually in German that means black leg. And it's interesting that having darkness in your legs is also a sign of severe birth trauma. But anyway, her book is called The Schwarzbein Principle. Schwarzbein Principle. She also has a cookbook. So you can begin to work right away on working with your trauma body and reducing cortisol levels, and you'll be a lot happier.
So make sure, if you would, because I'm not even going to try Schwarzbein, just make sure that I have her name as well and the name of the book. Make sure you put it on an email for me.
Yep, will do.
Okay, so thank you for those who have helped with this presentation.